Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive.
Always fun to be back.
Today we're diving into a book called The Beautiful Tree by Dharampal.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
Have you read it?
I have. It's a fascinating look at education in 18th century India.
It really is. It's easy to just assume that education back then was, limited maybe only for the elite.
Right, you'd think it was like a very niche thing, right?
Exactly. But Dharampal's main argument is that a really sophisticated and accessible education system was already thriving in India long before British rule.
And not just for like a select few, this was connected to the everyday lives of people in villages and towns.
It's really remarkable, and he backs all this up with actual historical documents.
Which is what makes it so compelling.
Yeah.
He's not just speculating, he's found accounts from British officials themselves who are often really surprised by what they found in India.
Yeah, and get ready for this one, because in the 1830s, a British official named William Adam was sent to survey schools in Bengal and Bihar.
Okay.
And what he found was astounding and estimated 100,000 village schools.
Wow, 100,000.
100,000.
That's incredible.
It's mind-boggling, right?
You just don't think about that kind of scale when you think about education in that period.
Exactly. And Adam wasn't the only one who noticed this.
Yeah.
Thomas Monroe, another British official working in the Madras presidency, said something similar.
Really?
He noted that every village had a school.
Wow. A school in every village. This is just amazing.
I know, right? It really challenges the whole narrative we often hear about education in India during that time.
It completely flips the script. I mean, even if those numbers are off by a bit, and remember they're coming from meticulous surveys done by these British administrators, it still points to a level of educational access that's just incredible.
It really does. So we're not just talking about a few scattered schools here. We're talking about a vast and intricate network.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets even more interesting because these weren't your typical, schoolhouses either. We're talking about pathshalas, madrassahs, gurukulas, all these different institutions that were woven into the very fabric of Indian society.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What were these institutions like?
Well, unlike maybe the image that comes to mind, these institutions were supported by the entire community, not just the wealthy.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't just for the privileged?
Not at all. Even farmers who couldn't read or write themselves contributed to these schools. They understood the value.
Or they were invested in their community?
Exactly. Education was a communal thing. And that speaks volumes about how important it was. Considered it wasn't this separate thing. It was part of everyday life.
Yeah, it was part of the fabric of their society.
Precisely. And that right there challenges the narrative of education being a privilege only for the elite. We're talking about access for a broad spectrum of society.
And it's even more interesting when we consider what was happening in England at the same time.
Oh, right, because England was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly, and they were busy developing their factory schools.
Focused on, churning out workers who could just memorize facts.
So different from what was happening in India.
Completely different. It's a stark contrast.
Yeah, it was a very different approach in India.
So what was the focus then if it wasn't just about, memorizing facts?
It was about the bigger picture, preparing young minds not just for jobs, but for life itself.
Okay, so like a more holistic approach.
Yeah, exactly, for their roles in their families, their communities, the world.
That's interesting. So what kind of subjects did this holistic education actually involve?
Well, it went beyond just the basics like reading, writing, arithmetic.
Right, of course.
We're talking about literature, moral teachings, even practical skills related to agriculture and commerce.
Wow, so they were really equipping students with skills for a variety of different paths.
Precisely, a much more well-rounded approach.
And get this, Adam, in his survey of Bengal and Bihar, he actually outlined 4 distinct stages of elementary education.
4 stages, so like different levels of learning?
Exactly, they had a whole system in place.
That's fascinating.
And it started with the most basic level, tracing letters in the sand.
Oh, wow. So like really hands-on learning from the very beginning. Exactly. It makes sense, right? Especially for young children.
It does make learning more tactile, more engaging.
And then from there, they progressed to writing on palm leaves.
Palm leaves, that's cool.
And finally, they graduated to using paper.
It sounds like they really put a lot of thought into the progression.
They did. It's really impressive. And the curriculum itself, they went above and beyond even the arithmetic lessons Adam noted were often more advanced than what was being taught in England at the time.
Really? So they were ahead of the curve in some ways.
It seems that way. And, all of this makes those firsthand accounts from the beautiful tree even more fascinating.
Oh yeah, the anecdotes from the British officials who actually observed these classes in action.
Exactly. Do you remember that one about the classroom in Malabar?
Oh yeah, the one where the kids were learning math through songs.
Yes, can you imagine that?
It's amazing. Such a creative approach. And they were writing in the sand, too.
It was all about engaging the senses, making learning a more immersive experience.
It's brilliant, really, and it shows a deep understanding of how children learn best.
Absolutely. And speaking of innovative teaching methods, there's also the monitorial system or mutual instruction that Dharampal talks about.
Right, where older students help teach younger ones.
Exactly like peer tutoring.
And that method actually became the basis for the Bell and Lancaster systems in Europe.
Which were,
They revolutionized education in Europe.
wow, so these cutting-edge European educational systems actually had their roots in 18th century India.
It's incredible, right? It really flips the script on how we usually think about the history of education.
It really does. And all of this makes me wonder even more about how this whole system was funded, because we're talking about 100,000 schools, even simple ones. That's a lot of money.
It is a good question, and the beautiful tree actually sheds some light on this. It turns out traditional Indian governance had this concept of designated revenue streams.
Okay, so tell me more about these revenue streams.
So basically, a good chunk of the revenue collected wasn't just going to the ruler or anything like that. It was specifically set aside for public services and, what was considered a key public service.
Education.
Exactly.
So it was built into the system from the ground up.
It was, and Dharampal found all these fascinating records of how these revenue assignments were allocated. We're talking about designated funds for teachers, for maintaining temples, which often housed schools, even for religious figures who played a role in education.
Wow, so it was a really multifaceted system.
It wasn't just about kings and taxes. It was about supporting the community and its future.
Which makes it even more sad when we think about what happened when the British took over.
It's true. This vibrant, intricate system really started to unravel under British rule.
And a big part of that was because they centralized revenue.
Exactly. They disrupted the funding structure that had supported this incredible system of education for centuries. And it wasn't just the funding. They started imposing their own ideas about education, like their own curriculum, their own way of doing things.
Which, if we're being totally honest, were probably influenced by those factory schools they had back in England.
It's very likely, right?
It makes you wonder if they even recognized the value of what they were disrupting in India.
That's the question, isn't it? And both Dharampal and G.W. Leitner, another scholar who studied education in Punjab, they documented this decline in their writing.
Yeah, they weren't just writing about it like it was no big deal. They were really concerned by what they were seeing.
Absolutely. And Leitner, in 1882, he wrote about how tens of thousands acquired a proficiency in Persian, which is now rarely reached. So you get a sense of what was being lost.
Yeah, a whole way of learning and thinking. So it's a complicated story, right? We've got this amazing, vibrant system of education in 18th century India that was really rooted in community, incredibly sophisticated, and far more extensive than most people realize.
It really makes you rethink that whole period in India's history.
It does, because this wasn't a society that was just waiting around to be, enlightened. They had their own rich intellectual traditions, their own ways of learning. Yeah.
And those traditions were unfortunately systematically dismantled.
It's a tragedy,
Yeah.
but it also makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if this system had been allowed to just flourish and evolve without being interrupted? What would India's education landscape look like today?
It's such a good question. And I think even more importantly, what lessons can we learn from this system even now, centuries later?
Yeah, because this isn't just ancient history.
Not at all.
These are questions that are so relevant today about community support for education, about coming up with innovative ways to teach, about the very nature of education itself.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into The Beautiful Tree. It's definitely a dense book,
Yeah, I'll give you that.
but it's full of these amazing primary source documents that really take you back to that time.
Yeah, it's like a window into a world that's often forgotten or misrepresented, and it leaves you with so much to think about. How might India's intellectual and educational landscape have developed if this system had just been allowed to thrive?
It's definitely something I'll be thinking about for a while, and if any of our listeners are interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out The Beautiful Tree. It's a journey worth taking.
It really is.
Well, thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.
See them.